work. Yeah. All right.
Okay, we are about to be live. It's getting set up.
It showed up for me that we are live.
All right,
Yes, for me too.
let's take it away. Um, Hi, everybody. Welcome to our FaceTime Live for our Mental Health Monday. Excited to have everybody here. I'm Jen Kohler. I am one of the founders and president of Atlas Assistance Dogs. Sarah and Michelle.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Pellizzari. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and professional dog trainer, and just am part of the Atlas Mental Health Committee. So joining in today to talk about our topic of the month.
And hi, I'm Michelle DeRosa. I'm also a licensed professional counselor and serve on the mental health committee at Atlas. I am not a service dog trainer, but I was a service dog handler for close to 10 years.
That is definitely training experience, though.
It
For
certainly had
sure.
lots of training involved.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think
And
sometimes we learn the most from our own dogs, honestly.
definitely. And I should mention, there will be a related blog coming out later tonight. I intended to post it before this, but just
I
realized I
don't
hadn't
know.
timing
I
wise.
hadn't looked
So
either, so
people can go and follow up with this in a related blog afterwards. So Sarah, do you want to start us out a bit?
sure. So we're kind of picking up off of the topic that we started last month. So we started talking about grief and loss as related to service dogs. And also, that doesn't just mean, your service dog has passed away. It could also mean that you are transitioning from one service dog to a new service dog. So kind of what those changes are like. And we last time was myself and Jen, and we sort of like shared sort of our own experiences. I came from the viewpoint of having trained therapy dogs and sort of how that's a little bit relatable to, having to transition from one work partner who's been with you for a really long time and then moving to a new work partner, and how not only that can be complicated, in terms of this is a different dog that might have different abilities, and whether or not it's a good match for you, but also just the emotional complexity that can come with that. So we thought this was a really good topic to kind of dig into, and also obviously talking about, grief and loss and how that impacts us as humans, and how that can be really hard to navigate. It doesn't always feel like we have a lot of resources at our disposal when it comes to talking about service dogs in particular, I think, and making these changes and transitions. So picking up from there, I don't know if Michelle would like to share anything about sort of where she's coming from in this conversation, just to
Yeah.
give everyone a little bit of a background.
Yeah. I wasn't able to come to last talk. So if I get into topics where we've already covered, just say, oh yeah, we covered that. But where I'm coming from and what I feel like I can bring to this conversation is the experience of what it's like to lose your service dog unexpectedly, and then that transition into what's next, and the rocky road of deciding getting another service dog, what if that doesn't work out, and all of the in-betweens there. So behind me, that picture is of my service dog, Samson, who passed away a couple years ago now. I can't believe it's been a couple years. And I wrote for the blog a little snippet for that. So if you're interested in kind of hearing my like raw feelings about that time, I found that that was really helpful for me when that happened. It was so unexpected. That looking back, from with like a clearer mind, I could really see that I was very much so looking for some support, something. Even if you plan, like I think all of us, either as pet owners or service dog handlers or just people in general, I believe we're all kind of striving and planning and looking for the next thing. And like, especially those of us with anxiety. Maybe we were over planners, but in all of my life, like in my time with Samson as my service dog, I had planned a euthanasia, like, oh, when he's older, well, he was already in soft retirement. He was upwards of almost like, he was like 10-ish, like, and well, yeah, about there. So we were like, okay, he's in retirement, like going to some things, not to others. And so I had in my mind this like idealized, okay, when this time comes, this is what it's going to look like. And I'll be transitioning, hopefully a service dog in training. And it just was really out of the blue. We knew he was sick. I knew he was not feeling well, but I had taken him to multiple vets and, oh, it's his back, oh, it's his shoulder. And then it turned out he had cancer that was pretty significant. And so I was not prepared for that, walking into an emergency situation and walking out without him. So I talk about my raw feelings in that blog of just that, now what? And I think that's an important piece, is a lot of people have that experience where you've planned for grief and loss, whether it be for loved ones, like humans, but also animals. And what do you do with it? And so I'm happy to kind of share what was helpful for me to like survive emotionally and even physically the really difficult points of that transition into a new normalcy. And also just if Sarah, Jennifer, if there's any like questions or things, that's kind of where I'm coming from. But when it comes to like the service dog and training, the balance of like, how soon do you get a new service dog in training, and when the timing of that worked out, and what happens if that service dog isn't, there's every service dog is at a different, in training is at a different timetable. And so there's so many unknowns. And I think that's what's so difficult about this journey. And I'm sure you talked about that last month, is just so many variables and unknowns to try to manage while you're dealing with disability.
Well, thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate actually that you were willing to share your experience. I think when we are willing to be vulnerable and share from
Yeah.
our own lens, it's so helpful to other people. And I wanted to say too, I can really validate what I'm hearing in your own experience, because my experience, it was kind of the same thing where it was like, something is wrong with your dog, but you don't really think, hey, it's going to lead to A, B, C, and I'm going to have to make these tough decisions. And I'm gonna have to make them pretty quickly because there's really
Yeah.
no choice, right? So I think that unexpected variable really comes into play for like so many of us when
Yeah.
we have a dog or any animal, and we're having to make those big life choices around them. So I wanted to validate. I had a very similar experience
Yeah.
happen with my first working partner who was with me, and how I had the same idea where I was like, yeah, I'm gonna have like the in-home euthanasia, or he's gonna just peacefully die in his sleep. And that's not what ended up happening, right? I won't go into like detail because I don't want to trigger anybody, but
Yeah.
it was a very like traumatic kind of experience to go through
Yeah.
that, and
Yeah.
to realize like it's not necessarily something that's going to be within our control, right? And within our grasp.
Yeah.
And so the fact that you were looking for resources is so relatable, because that was really a time where I too was like, who's going to help me, with
Yeah.
this decision-making process? This is really hard. And, even the veterinary side of that is so complex. And sometimes there isn't a clear decision on what is the best thing to do, but they'll lay out the options for you. And then it's like, you have to be that person who makes this big decision. So I think oftentimes, it's not always cut and dry, and that can be really tough too. So I
Yeah.
wanted to go back to that first, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about your other point that you were talking about, that it can be difficult when to decide like it's the right time,
Yeah.
to get another service animal to work with you, because I think that can be a whole nother layer of just, complex decision
Yeah.
making, and potentially like some grief coming up, and potentially like resurgence of symptoms, which we
Yeah.
didn't really talk about last time. So those I think would be some good things we can talk about today. I don't know
Yeah.
if Jen, you have anything to add in there too, just in terms of what we're talking about with just making some of those decisions. And
Yeah, no, I mean, the dog that I raised and trained for my father, is a service dog we lost a little over a year ago. And it was the same thing. It was, we were hoping that he could enjoy kind of a quiet retirement, that we were going to have at least another year with him. He had just turned 13. And then it was just a really sudden take him to emergency and wait for results that day. And then to get a phone call and like just sort of have to sit across the table from each other with the phone on speakerphone from the vet telling us how he was, that his whole body was full of sepsis and infection. And we had to make a decision essentially on the spot. And, to go say, went and said goodbye to him that day. And
so
then
super sudden. That's
it's
so
really
hard.
sudden. And
Yeah.
and I was grateful by then my dad was living with me and we could make that decision together. But it's still so hard when you're looking at a quality of life for your partner, and then you're going around. And I think the interesting thing with those decisions or with grief is it's not just like it's a moment in time. Like there's constant reminders when you're used to your service dog with you. It's sort of you find yourself talking to them and they're not there. It's this sort of constant, oh, I want to go do this routine that I do every day of that I need to go feed my dog and walk my dog and do all these things. I reach for them in bed. There's all these things that are ritualized that suddenly are gone. And so I think it is, and that's true for anybody that has a pet too. But I think for those of us with service animals, are sort of recognizing that that depth of that bond is even more intense often, and that the absence of them in your day-to-day life is even more obvious. And so, unfortunately, I think probably many people who've had animals who've had to have those sudden decisions.
But you're talking about too that, with a service dog, it is different because there is that layer of they are literally working with you. Like, I mean, I'd assume for most people, like at least on a daily basis, right? So they are a working partner with you, and it's a very consistent, not only consistent bond, but there is some degree of like, needing to rely on them for help and with different things. And how does that play out too when they're no longer there and there might be a gap, maybe it was so sudden, like you weren't even thinking about training another dog, like as a successor, because that absolutely can happen at any time, right?
Something that before I kind of share maybe a little bit about how I navigated that and how maybe Jen navigated, Jen, I really appreciate you sharing that like raw feeling of that, like the patterns that you're like searching for them, you're talking to them, you're looking for them. And for me, and I won't get like it too specific so I don't get emotional and I don't trigger other people, but like I really felt this like I don't even know what to do. I don't know what life looks like now. It just was so like there was a before and there's an after, and that's true for any grief. And I remember just finding like there was just such a deficit of adequate support. Like I think I reached out to you guys and was like, hey, this happened, and I got so much an outpouring of love and support. So like Alice, like y'all were amazing. And they were like, oh, there's a support group for service dog, loss of service dog. I was like, amazing. So I called, I got the screening, and then I go to join the first meeting and no one showed up. I got ghosted by this group, and I just felt so like I think they just like stopped meeting, and like even though they screened me, they just kind of it was like done by some elderly people. So I didn't want to assume, but I just felt so like I have so many thoughts and feelings and replaying over and over again. Like you talked about that traumatic moment. And so what was helpful for me was to like just raw talk about it to friends, family, my therapist. There's like a service dog subforum on like a subreddit and like a pet loss subreddit. And I just wrote read and wrote. And like, that was a space to put the emotions in like in a place where people could like yeah, they're living that pain, and they're living, and like for a service dog form, they like you just said,
I get
it's
it.
different. Like, and getting that affirmation that I could be seen, that like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, this is different. And so I wanted us to speak to that, where it's like it can feel so isolating and alone because of the heaviness of the content. So getting support is so, so important.
Yes,
Yeah.
and you're also speaking to, that must have been really disheartening and disappointing when the group didn't happen, right? You
Yeah.
joined, you thought like, hey, there's going to be this good support,
Mhm.
but yet you knew like for yourself, you really needed to push on and you
Yeah.
needed to find that support somehow. And so you were still able to access some resources. And maybe
Yeah.
that's, worth speaking to today, is because sometimes it will take some work, and it's really hard to do that kind of work when you are grieving. But to have that kind of support, I think is pivotal. I think it makes all the difference. It can
Mhm.
make the difference between us internalizing too much and, maybe going back to like unhealthy habits or like, unhealthy ways of coping versus like accessing, getting it all out in the open, finding some way to really process what's going on, I think is really crucial. So I'm glad that you pointed that out. I'm sorry that that was such a difficult experience, especially with
Yeah.
the group not happening. And I found too that really there doesn't seem like there are a lot of service dog specific resources, but
Mhm.
that, the Reddit, I think that's a great example of, hey, sometimes we have to tap into things that maybe we don't think about at first,
Yeah.
right? That could be a potential line of support. So,
I do
Yeah.
want to say in that I do think it's also important to respect people's individual way of processing grief.
Mhm.
yeah,
Some people very
absolutely.
much want to talk about it and want
Hmm.
to discuss it, and other people really don't.
That's true too.
And giving space for the person to say, here's what I need.
Oh,
And here's what will help
absolutely.
me versus offering, kind of pushing, tell me about this, or do you want to
Yeah.
talk? Like, I
Yeah.
think when we're trying to help people, sometimes we can push our style. And
Hmm.
so I think that is something important too, is to kind of like recognize sometimes our role is just to listen, or sometimes our role is just to give that person space or to give yourself space.
Right. That's
Maybe
absolutely
it's
true.
just going on a walk. It's,
Yeah.
what ends up being healing.
Yeah. And taking the time that you need. So I was very fortunate to be able to like take time off of work. And at the time I'm working for it was my private practice. So it's like I am approving my work. I didn't have to like justify it with an employer, but I recognize that like with disenfranchised grief, or grief that other people might not see as valid or enough, that can be really challenging or difficult. But if there is a way to really give yourself space, if you're able to, that can be an incredible resource too. So that, as Jennifer was just saying, you could be by yourself, or you can use that time, which may not be accessible for others. But in my grief journey, I just wasn't able to do anything for several weeks. Of course, I would like slowly then take several weeks off, but at least um, a good chunk of time. Because in my role, if I show up and I'm not able to do effective therapy with someone, that's a part of our ethics and things. So it may look different for people who have different roles and jobs and responsibilities, being a parent, being a caretaker. Um, yeah.
That's a really good point, Michelle. And I think, taking the space when we can is absolutely beneficial. It is interesting to think about, well, some of our listeners maybe they're not like maybe they're not going to work every day, right? Maybe that's not part of their life. So like what would support look like for them? And really being able to ask yourself that question, I think is crucial. So just knowing like what you do need, right? For
Yeah.
some people, I guess if your service dog might be your way of being able to navigate the public and navigate everyday life and being out in the world. So when that is gone, that is almost like taking a layer of social support away too, right? In a way
Yeah.
to be able to be out in the world. So what can you do in those circumstances when that I don't want to say like mitigated what was, your disability, but that was helping you to be able to get out and to be able to socialize in a different way, perhaps.
Yeah.
What do you do in those circumstances? I think that's a really good question because, the isolation, I think, yes, some people are going to process where they want more space, but then I think some people it could actually put them into more isolation than would be healthy for them, right?
Yeah.
And so what would be like some other way to access support? So I think
Yeah.
part of why we're talking about this topic is trying to figure out some of those like tougher situations where, maybe it isn't like, oh, we're able to go to work every day situation. And I think it's great, I was able to take some time off too, and that was super helpful to me, but also can understand how maybe that's not somebody else's life situation, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Another
Yeah.
piece is when you do go out to familiar places and or back to work, when people recognize, oh, where's Samson?
Mhm.
Where's your service dog? I didn't want to interrupt you, Jen. You're
No,
about
you
to
can.
pop in.
Mm-mm. No.
Yeah.
Um, no, I
But
agree. And that's a very similar of, and I think even the asking where's the dog, some of that comes in even when you've retired them. And they're
yes.
still
mhm,
there when they're used to. And that just happened. I was at a conference that I've brought Theo to for 9 years. And he's
Yeah.
retired now. And many of these people have known me, his whole life, if not
mhm,
longer. And they were like the number of people that were scared to ask me, where's Theo? And so I'd like preempt like Theo's okay. He's
mhm,
just retired.
Yeah.
But it's still just sort of this reminder of, and I had a lot of symptom reoccurrence at that particular conference because it was really
Yeah.
hard to not have Theo at a conference that I was used to having him at. It
Yeah.
was a pretty intense conference. And um, so I think there's that grief of retirement too, is just sort of and when people ask when they're used to that can kind of be an ongoing re-triggering almost,
it is
Yeah.
even
really
though
hard
people are
to
being
have to
kind and it's
explain,
very,
right?
yeah.
To get those questions, and it's a whole other thing to navigate with people is how do you explain, well, my dog is retired or, my dog died. Like, how do you, say that without like triggering yourself and like bringing up, a whole
Yeah.
layer of grief for yourself when
I
you're
Yeah.
at
don't
a
think you
conference, right?
can.
No, and I think
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's very natural
Yeah.
for people to ask, right? They're
Yeah.
being kind.
Oh,
Yeah.
It's
absolutely.
like,
They're
Yeah.
curious. They saw you for 9 years with the
Yeah.
but it's like at the same time, it's like, how do you navigate that new
Yeah.
space, right? And
Yeah.
and people aren't gonna know, right? But I think for us sort of being, I guess, um, preparing ourselves a little bit for those situations, it kind of reminds me, and I know this is not the same thing, but when you're having to go out in public with a service dog and like getting questions just about having a
Yeah.
dog, right?
Yeah.
So, and for a lot of us, okay, maybe it's an annoyance, but it's not like super difficult. But then for some people, if you have really crippling social anxiety, that is a whole other layer, right?
Yeah.
Having to answer questions. So, my heart goes out to people that are really, going through this and have a lot of anxiety about just being in public anyway, and then
Yeah.
having this other piece come up for them. I think
Yeah.
it's a lot more complicated than sometimes we speak to. So that's a
Yeah.
good example of just one piece of how this can be really complicated to navigate.
I know for me, because it just the field that I'm in, I had to discuss it. I mean, clients, the relationship between a therapist and a client is rife with all sorts of things. And if something changes, it really needs to be addressed in the room, especially I'm working with trauma clients. So when things change, there's a lot that happens. So I practiced having the conversation in the mirror, or having, where's Sam, or holding, like anticipating holding, because when you tell, even if you're not a clinician, I know it's a very, very specialized example here, but if you are talking to someone that go to the same store and oh, where's Sam, or where's your service dog? Oh, he passed away. And then they have an emotional reaction.
yeah.
Then often there's this, I need to contain their emotional reaction instead of mine or with mine. And so I practiced, and I also practiced boundaries. So within that, if somebody asked and they're like, oh, what happened? Are you okay? Blah, blah, blah. I would say some of this would be across the board, not just at my work, but elsewhere. I'd say, I'm sure you can understand that I don't want to talk about it, or that I don't think that it's helpful for me to talk about this right now. And framing it like that, sometimes it put the awareness of like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like, I wouldn't want to talk about it either. But boundaries, I think when we talk about how do we have those conversations, the same that we talked about months ago of having a service dog in public is your level, and maybe depending on how you're feeling and your resiliency, and maybe even depending on the person. There might be some people that I'm feel more safe to have deeper conversations versus the person who I would have much higher boundaries and just maybe not even bring it up for a
Yeah.
long time.
I'm really glad you spoke to that, Michelle, because I think boundaries really are crucial, and that sometimes, we have to set them almost like preemptively ahead of
Yeah.
time and say, yeah, have those mirror conversations with yourself. If you know you're going to go to X cafe and that you usually have your dog with you, and you're going to get a lot of questions if you just go and hang out there, without your dog, like, how do you want to respond to people? Like, what feels comfortable to you? And that it's okay to say, "I don't wanna talk about this," right? And you can set those boundaries, and that's absolutely fine. I think that you have to do what's best for you. I know, like, as as a therapist too, it's different with your clients, right? Like, you were
Mhm.
talking about having to hold the space for them, which, it's a whole other layer of
Yeah.
complicated for us. Like, I will say that, just with, retiring dogs, like, in my work, like, that is a whole other layer of something to help people process through. But for, our listeners who have service dogs, that you're able to draw those boundaries of what you want to talk about and what you want to share and who you want to share it with, if you want to
Yeah.
share anything with them, right?
hmm Yeah. And also the boundary of, we talk about healthy or helpful boundaries, leave like has space for the expectations, or setting up like boundaries that people can meet or make. What I mean by that is, like, if I'm talking to a friend and what I really need to hear from them, if we're going to talk about the loss of the service dog, is to hear that it's different than pet loss, or that I need to hear that validation or affirmation that this special, like my partner, my like partner in crime, like my medical support, my mental health support, like the intricacies of that relationship is respected. Then when I have that conversation, I'm going to communicate that need to my friends or my family or whoever I'm speaking to, so that that need can be met. And I don't leave those conversations. And when they're sharing about pet or their own, because that's how humans connect, is if
Mhm.
what we're doing here, I'm sharing about my experience and Sarah, and then, but we're all validating each other's experiences. Like, yes, that is hard, or yes, this is different, or whatever. So I think that's important too, in weaving in what you need to feel supported when you are sharing about your grief and loss.
Right. And because people may not be able to relate exactly to, what someone is going through when they lose a service dog, but they can offer up a level of support that says, I don't understand exactly what you're going through, but I'm here to listen, and, I'm here to help you, and you can let me know, like, how can I be supportive too?
Yeah.
Sometimes I think with grief and loss, we get into sort of these platitudes or things that we think are
Mhm.
helpful to other people, and that's just speaking about grief in general, but a lot of
Yeah.
times it's not things that are really helpful to people. So, I think the more we're learning about, how individuals, process grief and loss, and how it is just so very individual, and that a lot of the things that we thought maybe were helpful things to say just aren't helpful things. We're getting better at this. There's more awareness, but I think then there's that layer, of, when it's an animal that's that disenfranchised loss again that comes up, where it is, again, something where I think there's so much more awareness than there used to be. I feel like social media has actually really helped promote a lot of awareness around grief and loss, just because now, some of those big, powerhouse therapists and people that really are like very well skilled in grief and loss are putting it out there of like, these aren't helpful things. And then all these people are chiming in and saying, yes, that wasn't helpful to me. This wasn't helpful to me. So now that's like that connection and that awareness is really spreading. But that is taking some time for us to catch up, I think, when it comes to, in particular service animals and providing those supports. But I do
Yeah.
think like things are much better now than they probably were before in terms of things that people can access.
Yeah.
Um, so that is a positive for sure.
Yeah. The I don't know if it's said the Doogie Center, or the Dougie Center, but it's DOGY.org is a center for the National Grief Center. And they have handouts, resources, webinars to equip those who are grieving and normalize things, but also those who like, I pass this out a lot for like what to say instead. And exactly what Sarah was
Yeah.
just talking about. Better
Right.
options.
Right.
Yeah. And you maybe
And
even to, if you're the grieving one, to read this and be able to arm yourself with this is what I need instead. So you said at least blah, blah, blah. And you can say, well, when you say at least this didn't happen, I really
mhm,
want to like hear XYZ.
right. Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the unfortunate thing is that sometimes we're in this position of grieving where we are almost having to educate other people of like what is helpful to us, which can be a really hard and like sensitive thing to
Yeah.
do. Someone will say something and we're immediately just like, oh my gosh, that was like such an insensitive thing to say, even if they didn't mean it that way, right? A lot of times these are things that people say, like they don't realize like maybe some of the harm that comes from things that they say. But then we're kind of put in this position of, I love that you said handouts. So that's like a very concrete thing, to help, prepare us with some skills. I didn't know if you had anything to add to that, Jen, or if we wanted to talk a little bit more about the next piece of this topic.
Other than that, when the blog is out, there are a lot of resources listed in there. And so I think that'll be another good thing for people to look at today. That'll be out tonight later on, so check out our website. Sorry that wasn't already there. But no, I think it'd be good to pivot to talking a bit about just the transition period, and the complexity of that. And I know we talked about talking some about kind of the grief that comes when a candidate service dog doesn't work out for the role.
Mhm.
So I kind of know, I know last time we talked some about that transition period. Um, but I don't know if we want to talk some about that candidate side not working out. That's something that I'm seeing a lot of our clients struggling with as we're working on successor dogs, of trying to find a good candidate. And then, how long are you in that process before you realize this just isn't going to work, and how invested are you in that dog? And
That's a
then the
good
dog's still a living being that you care about and
Mhm.
may have to rehome, because you can't support having, n number of dogs. And so I think that's a real challenge. And I think especially as, positive ethical trainers, where we're really looking out for the well-being of our dogs and really wanting our service dogs to be really thriving and happy,
Mhm.
we have to really dig in kind of deep sometimes and recognize, okay, they're not, yes, they could suck it up and maybe they could do this. And maybe if it's once a year, they have to do something that's a little stressful, that's okay. But if it's once a month or once a week, it's not.
Yeah.
And so I think it's, you know, we need to remember to put their needs first, but then also recognize what are our needs in terms of, okay, now how do we take care of it? Maybe their needs is to not be a working public access service dog.
Mhm.
So
I
that's,
think, yeah.
but
Sorry.
then if then becomes, okay, now that they've established that and we honor that, then what is our need? If we need a working public access service dog and they can't be, then the next thing is, well, can we keep them and start another dog, or do we need to
Yeah.
rehome them ethically and find them a good place?
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that's a pretty hard choice, and I think that's an area that service dog handlers get a lot of potential criticism from other pet dog people.
Mhm.
because there's very much, the pet dog, the concept of, hey, I'm going to keep this dog no matter what through everything they go through, and I'm going to take care of them the rest of their life. And that may not be possible for somebody who has a service dog to care for multiple dogs. Now, they're obviously going to make sure that dog is safe and well cared for the rest of their life, but they may not be able to do that. And I know that's something that I've seen people really get challenged or feel really guilty about rehoming that dog. Even though it's the best for that dog and the person needs to start with another service dog. So I don't know if you guys have thoughts on that, but I've seen that's an area that I feel like people that aren't service dog handlers really don't understand what may or may not be possible for someone with disabilities in terms of caring for multiple dogs.
Yeah, there are a couple of, really important things in there that you mentioned. I think in general, just normalizing that this happens, right? That's a big step, I think, in the right direction, just for people to understand that sometimes rehoming is in the best interest of the dog and the handler. And a lot of times, there are gray areas that we have to navigate where maybe it's not crystal clear, but we're like, well, how much of this is really working out versus how much of this is causing me more stress and, potentially causing the dog more stress. And, that goodness of fit, I think, comes into play in a lot of different ways, right? Um, so I think just having this out there and saying, hey, if you go through this experience, you're absolutely not the only person that does. I mean, obviously I don't have a service dog, but I've been through the rehoming experience with not rehoming, but therapy dogs that didn't work out. And then it is really difficult because you're like, well, how long do I give this? Like how long do you wait until you figured out it's not the right match? And you're asking the questions again, and maybe nobody really has the answers for you. So that can be really difficult. I think sometimes talking to other people and getting input and making sure you're talking to the right people, because throwing it out there to the general dog owning community like we talked about is probably not going to be very helpful. They're going to say,
Mhm.
oh, you need to try this, or you need to wait 6 months, and make sure like you've given it like this stretch of time. And yeah, so those are really good points. I don't know if Michelle has anything to add just based on kind of experience and if you're
Yeah.
willing to share anything there, but yeah.
Yeah, of course. I can definitely, looking back, and I wrote this in my little blurb, is like I could see after Sam passed, I went into like, and this is just me, into solution focus mode of like, what do I do? I know like I can already feel my disabilities and the progress. Like I'm in so much like distress that all the things physically that happen when you're in high distress gets worse,
Mhm.
chronic conditions and flares and all of this. So my brain is like, I don't know how I can see a future without having like the same type of help or better. And so it was it was a lot to
Yeah.
balance grief and then okay, well, the sooner that you can start a dog or get an application in or whatever, the sooner you can get help. But then there's this, are we making the best decisions when we're in our grief and loss mind? Like, also the periods of like, if you are getting a purpose bred dog, there's windows of breeding seasons
Mhm.
so there's a lot of crunch time. And for me, it was very helpful to consult with Atlas and like talk about and kind of bounce off. And if you have the ability, the privilege to be able to like have a temperament test or service dog trait, like someone walk alongside of you and point out like, okay, like maybe take or like family, like loved ones that can recognize when we're in an emotional state versus like a space to make long-term decisions. And I say that not like I'm like regretting my choices. It's just I think back and I could see how I was really trying to just feel better
Mhm.
anyway. And I have a service dog in training, still holds the title. His name is Banjo, and I got him. I feel like felt really soon after Samson had passed, and had kind of the contingency that you guys were talking about with the breeder. That's like, hey, if this, I think it was a couple months, like if we see these, like, even though this dog has passed a bunch of really great temperament tests and has a really great, lineage and family history and blah, 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 blah. If I'm not seeing or it's not clicking or something, can I return this dog? And it was like, yeah. So that was helpful to kind of put some of the pressure off of like, this is it. Now I don't know if I would have actually followed through if like I saw, like, because I was just in like it was just a lot. It was a lot of
Yeah.
like and in one way I would say that it was helpful was when you have a partnership with a service dog for many, many years, the thing, like, you've just have a rhythm. And so um when you start or you have a service dog in training, especially if it's a puppy, your rhythm and everything is just like starting fresh. So while I was just having to do a lot more activity, a lot more structure, a lot more movement. In some ways that really was like healing. Um, and I would say even my body and the flares, instead of like grief and loss kind of dictating my sleep and wake and eating schedule, I was on this puppy's schedule. And I saw some benefits and deficits. So both were true. Um, and then now, I mean, Banjo is over 2, and we had some life changes of moving. And in my mind, when I first had him, my mind was like by 2-ish, like he's going to be ready to go. Like he's going to be fully trained. He's going to be with me, like wherever. And that's just not happened because of this individual dog. And there's grief and frustration at times that I feel like had grief from losing a previous service dog, not been there, I probably wouldn't have pushed as hard or put myself to and our team at a different expectation. And his issue is he just doesn't like car rides. Like he's great everywhere else, hates the car, and we'll have like great, we'll have, as animals are, as progress and regression. And as you guys were saying, if it's a little bit of stress, a little bit of the time, okay. But there's had to be some decisions of like, we'll wait. And as he's gotten older and as he's gotten closer to more maturity at 3, I'm seeing lots of resiliency and confidence. So maybe that will be something we pick up. But in the meantime, I did not think I was even going to be able to function without having Sam or a Sam or something like that. And I have. And I've when I say I have, like I'm here, I'm survived, I'm doing other mitigation and things. And so that's been a very interesting journey personally of the life that I just couldn't even see. Looks different, and there's all sorts of feelings. And I think that I'll end my thing here by saying it was very helpful to have a therapy, like for myself, to talk about those things with my therapist of like, what does my identity look like now? Without having a service dog, but also my service dog in training isn't what I thought it was going to be. What does that make me as a service dog handler? Like, so it was just very helpful to move through all sorts of different stages of grief and loss and frustration and guilt and shame and all of that to kind of get to this place where I am now of like acceptance and kind of like, this would be great if this was happening. And like you guys talked about, maybe adding on like a additional starter if a certain time frame, but there's just a lot less pressure that I feel on myself. And that's been a almost 3-year journey.
Yes, yes. Yeah. I think what you're talking about, in therapy, it helps us to be able to reframe things, to get validation for our grief, but also to reframe the present and, sort of reconstruct what's happening in the present. And so when you're feeling really stressed or you're having a resurgence of symptoms, your decision making capabilities actually get smaller, right? Like it's not like it gets easier to make these really hard decisions. So having that sounding board and having somebody sort of help you through it, help you weed through some of that, I think can be really powerful and really helpful. So for some people, therapy sounds like a really scary thing, and some people have had not good experiences in
Right.
therapy. And so it can be something that we sort of tiptoe around when we're saying, hey, maybe I need to get back in. But it's okay to interview different therapists, to talk to different people, to get a feel for them before you commit to somebody. But I do think like that, can really just make it so much less stressful, and like you're almost talking about a sense of relief of like, hey, I don't have to figure this all out right now, right? Like I don't have
Mhm.
to know, all the answers. I don't have to be psychic and know like what's the trajectory for banjo, because it's impossible, right? Like there's just no way to really know. And we get these little curveballs like a dog who doesn't like to ride in the car, right? Who would have known? Sometimes even when they're socialized in cars, they still don't like the car.
Yeah.
So we learn these individual preferences about who they are. And then sometimes it's great because, we do find that we can shift, right? We do find that we have the capability to adapt, right? This is the dog you have in the future is never going to be the dog you had in the past. Like they're never going to be exactly the same. So I think sometimes we second guess ourselves with understanding our capabilities to adapt to those types of changes. Not to say that it's easy in any sense of the word when you're grieving to go through this, but that we are able to grow and we're able to adapt as humans. And so, having a sense of like that open-mindedness too. Yes, there could be the dog that's just not the right fit, but there could also be the dog that maybe isn't exactly what you thought they would be, but maybe they can still help you, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of helping people recognize maybe an in-home working dog
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
is
Like a
sufficient.
skilled companion.
Exactly. That could be that, for that person. I know in the owner training world, that's a conversation we have a lot at Atlas when people call us, or, we find out through assessment that the dog isn't suitable for public access work. It's helping people problem solve. Well, do you need the dog in public access work? Or, could they help you, kind of looking at, could they help you at home, maybe while you're starting to think about another dog, or, to help you at home, period, or, what are ways to kind of shift that. Um, and it's tricky, right? Because we're dealing with ourselves as people with disabilities doing this training. We're dealing with the dog who's a living being and who's unpredictable. And we can't guarantee how their behavior is going to change or how our conditions are going to change. So there's always unknowns. And so you're always second guessing. And so I think kind of like what you said, Michelle, of giving yourself that permission. It's like, okay, I don't have to have this pressure. I don't have to have a timeline. Um, I think that's really helpful. Um, and the flip, I think it's also really helpful for people to give themselves if they, rather than dragging things out, if they're like, okay, this really isn't going to work. I think it can be really, really helpful to just make a decision. Um, so that you can move on to the next step. Um, is that to start with a different dog, rehome the dog, keep the dog,
Yeah.
kind of, and that's also personal and individual. And, I think helping people see that there's not a right or a wrong. It's very individual to that person and that dog, and giving room for that. And it doesn't mean, and I see people question this, it doesn't mean you don't need a service dog, that you can function without one,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean,
Mhm.
sort
Yeah.
of second guessing that and questioning that of, am I disabled enough? Well, you can function
Yeah.
without this. It's like, yes, but the fact that we can survive is not necessarily how many more spoons does it take? How much more energy does it take? How
Yes.
much,
Yeah.
more could we do if we had that dog?
That's a
Yeah.
really good distinction that you made,
Yes.
and I'm sure that that comes up for a lot of people when there is this sort of period of not having a service dog and, questioning, well, what is this something I really need? And like that's such a painful thing to even be asking yourself, right?
Yes, yes.
So I'm glad you're able to reframe that as, but what does my life look like potentially with a service dog that could enhance my quality of life, that could make it so that I can do all of the things that I need to do and that I want to do in my life. So reframing it in that way, right?
Mhm.
And hopefully
Absolutely.
getting more acceptance, in society about
Yeah,
service dogs. There's so much skepticism, I think, there that it
yeah.
is really hard, especially when we're talking about invisible disabilities. That's really
Right.
tough territory to navigate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just normalizing that, as we've talked about multiple times, that disability looks different every day. And so people have an option, a plethora of different resources. And a service dog can be for a time, or it could be for a day, or, the day, but then at one place, but not the other. And so I think it does help lower the stigma or lower the pressure that what people perceive service dogs to be, or the if you're stating you need a service dog, why don't you have one right now? Well, obviously you don't need it,
Exactly.
which is very harmful. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm recognizing we have just a few more minutes today. I don't know what else we wanted to cover and kind of closing here. I did want to let people know we will have this regular talk in November. I think that we're going to be talking more about holiday safety and dogs and kinds
Yeah.
of things to think about in the holidays. And then we're going to take December off and be back in January. But I don't know if there was any other areas around this we wanted to bring up other than, like I said, the blog will be out. Oh, I know one was in the blog, we have Michelle's story. We really encourage people here who are willing, please share your story related to any aspect of what we've been talking about grief with your dog, be it of, finding the stress of finding a candidate, of that not being a fit, of retiring them, of transitioning from your relationship or bond from the former dog to the new dog when you have them both. Anything around losing them, anything you're willing to share, we would love to put that together in a subsequent follow-up blog, because I think it's really helpful. It's really validating to have other people to see other people's experiences. And so if you're willing to share that, please email us. Just email info@atlasdog.org to the title grief blog. If you're willing to share a picture of your dog and you, that's great. If not, that's okay. If you just want first name used or different name used, just let us know. We will honor whatever you want. But we'd really appreciate it if you're willing to share that with our broader community.
Yeah, this has been a good talk. And, feel free to chime in the comments too if, you want to let us know your thoughts. Or to email as well. And we should have, I think, another blog then coming up. So we'll kind of piggyback off of this blog post so people can feel welcome to share. And then just as always, if you feel like you need to talk through this topic, just encouraging you to utilize Atlas and their wonderful team because they can kind of help you through some of the sticky decision making that we're talking about today and a lot of the things that we're talking about that come up. So you don't have to do this in isolation by any means.
Absolutely.
Michelle, anything else to add?
I think that everyone has covered anything I could say. So, yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to stop the live feed. This will be available on video for people to follow up.